The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Red Flags, Identifying Victims Under Supervision. This presentation is part of a training and technical assistance grant funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. This webinar is the product of an ongoing partnership between the American Probation and Parole Association, the Battered Women's Justice Project, and the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. My name is Megan Foster. I'm a program analyst at APPA. I've worked on criminal justice issues for about 10 years and currently manage a variety of APPA's grant-funded projects, ranging anywhere from workforce and workload issues, tribal programs, victims issues and community supervision, justice reform, and evidence-based practices. Prior to coming to APPA, I worked as direct practitioner and program manager in a victim services and women's reentry programs. Jim?
Hi, my name is Jim Henderson. I currently work at the Battered Women's Justice Project as a technical assistance provider regarding issues related to probation, coordinated community response, and battery intervention treatment. I also am working with the Institute on Strangulation Prevention and the Family Justice Center. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much, Megan.
All right, and Connie?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Connie Neal, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Just a few words about my organization. We are a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization which works to support nearly 100 domestic violence programs across our state. And altogether, those programs serve over 55,000 survivors of domestic violence each year. My organization also works to improve statewide responses to domestic violence, including policy development for probation and community corrections professionals. I've also been working with APPA for nearly 20 years to improve best practices for working with victims of intimate partner violence. In addition, I've previously managed multiple alternatives to incarceration, reentry, and community supervision services in New York, and provide training and technical assistance on community supervision and domestic violence issues on the national level. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you have joined us today.
Great. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started this morning. You all should be in mute. I'm seeing a hand raise already. Hold on. Okay, so you should all be muted. If at any point in time you guys have questions, please use the question box to ask questions. If it's something simple, I'll go ahead and answer it in the moment. Otherwise, we will save those until the end of the presentation in case they have already been answered. But I will be monitoring those throughout, so please ask questions if you have any at any point in time. Okay. So the goal of the current project is to improve community supervision responses to victims of intimate partner violence who are currently under community supervision. Today's webinar provides an introduction to working with this population. For anyone interested in learning more about this particular topic, please contact me for more information on training opportunities. My contact information will be available at the end of the training.
All right, so for many victims of intimate partner violence, their pathways into the criminal justice system can be due to a whole range of crimes, either directly or indirectly related to their abuse. And in the next few minutes, we're going to be setting the context for some of these pathways into the criminal justice system and just how they tie back to some red flags that are important for community corrections professionals to look for. Some of the crimes directly connected to abuse include survivors using force to protect themselves or their children. If for a moment you can imagine a survivor in their home and they're being cornered in their kitchen. She's backed up against the kitchen sink and is being strangled. In that split second before she loses consciousness, she reaches behind her and finds a steak knife in the sink. In that moment, she may have no other choice than to use that knife to protect herself and save her own life. Another example is a survivor fleeing a location to protect herself and her children and ends up being charged with parental kidnapping. It's common for many survivors to hear multiple threats from their abusers about their physical safety of their children as well. Some examples of those kinds of threats include, if you leave me, the next time you see the kids is when you go visit their gravestones. Or, if you want custody kids, I'll make sure you're together forever. Crimes indirectly connected to abuse include prostitution, drug dealing, welfare fraud, bad checks, and credit card theft. Many survivors have few options for how they can support themselves and meet basic needs such as food and clothes. And for many of these survivors, they're forced to support their abusers as well and have little control or access to finances, whether it be their own or shared with their abusive partner. For example, an abuser may tell the survivor that diapers, formula, or shoes for the kids are just too expensive and the abuser is not going to pay for it. Over time, the options that victims have to support themselves and their children may become narrower and narrower and result in difficult choices such as having to deal drugs or steal a credit card for financial survival issues. So over the past few years, we've learned a lot about the pathways of victims of intimate partner violence who enter the criminal justice system. A lot of this research started in the early 2000s, and many of the points here on this slide are still very relevant today. We know that, for example, 56% of victims committed a crime to please their partner. Nearly half committed a crime to get drugs for their partner. 40% admitted to a crime that was committed by their partner. Nearly a third committed a crime because they were threatened by their partner. Over half lied to hide their partner's crime, and 1 out of 5 chose to go to jail to avoid their partner's abuse. So for many of these victims, jail was really thought of as a safe house for them. Many would enter with bruises, black eyes, scratches, cuts, injuries, but they knew they were in a place where they felt like they were going to be okay for a few days and they could heal. So what do we know about women under probation and parole supervision? I think quite simply the vast majority are victims of domestic violence. For probation and parole and community corrections professionals, if you have 10 women on your caseload, assume at least 8 of those women have been physically abused. And also know that nearly half have been raped or sexually abused. And certainly when it comes to intimate partner sexual assault, that information is just so totally under the radar of so many people. It's just a really important point to be aware of. And again, it's meant to be another red flag for you to dig a little bit deeper when you are in the process of supervising that person.
So when considering all the crimes or all the pathways into the criminal justice system that Connie just talked about, we realize that there's a lot of people who we're supervising, whether it be pretrial, probation, parole, incarceration, who actually got there really by not from their own commitment to commit a crime, but really because of the circumstances they found themselves in the way that they didn't necessarily know how to get out. I'm wondering, from the people that we have on the audience here who are actually practicing probation officers, what are some of the signs that you guys have seen? It's been a red flag that says Janice might be a victim of domestic violence, or Michelle might have been coerced into committing a crime. Is there anything that you guys could add in? And maybe Megan, you could kind of explain to them how to chat in so we can tap into the experience that we have in the room?
Absolutely. So there should be a full chat option where everyone can talk to everybody in the room. So if you do have feedback for Jim, please put it in that chat function. The question box is another option if that's easier to access.
And we'll give people a few minutes to kind of write in. What I'm really looking for is types of things that were kind of red flags that gave you permission to pause and wonder what was going on.
All right, so a couple of things that I'm seeing, Jim.
Right.
Strange injuries,
Okay.
nervousness, like radical changes in somebody's health.
Great. So, and some of those things are things that we had found too, like when we had a completely veiled woman, a Muslim woman who came in, and all of a sudden she wasn't able to walk into our office in her normal chip herself, right? She sat down in a chair, extremely slow. You could tell this woman was in great amounts of pain. So then to go down that avenue and kind of figure out what's going on with this person. Sometimes we see people who are wearing clothes that are inconsistent with the weather, right? It's a pretty nice warm day out today, and she decided to wear a turtleneck. We might question at her, why is she always wearing long sleeve shirts, puts her coat over her hand when she comes into the room? Being aware of that. It may be different amounts of makeup. I was just listening to, it was a video of a woman who had been strangled and beaten and drugged around the home. And unfortunately, the court reduced her down to a misdemeanor domestic violence. But she was able to show pictures of her 2 weeks after the incident, where she had extremely heavy amounts of makeup, trying to cover up her bruises, trying to hide what had happened to her. So being aware of what makeup's going on, if we see hickeys going on, are they purposeful? Some people are saying that they're seeing more and more tattoos. I have not experienced this directly myself, but in our trainings around the country, we have had, I think in every location, there has been probation officers who come in and found maybe even, let's say, excuse my language, but I might say, my name's Jim. So my victims, I may have said Jim's bitch on her name, on her body. Or that they've had to post certain things that show that she's my property, that she belongs to me, has been a huge area of concern of what's going on with these women. Moving in too quickly with a partner, we find a lot of times perpetrators like to pretend that they're rescuing people. And also when they feel they rescue people, they feel that person is indentured to them. So if I have someone who met some guy 2 weeks ago and they're moving in with him right now, there may be areas for me to be concerned about their welfare, what's going on, and how are they setting themselves up for possible future abuse, and how we can reach out to that person and offer support. We've also talked about an inconsistency with attending classes, showing up for drug tests, or even paying for classes. So oftentimes a batterer, as punishment to his victim, he may just deny her access to the car so she can't get to a class, deny her access to money to pay for a drug test. He may actually coerce her to use. At occasions, it may be safer for me to go ahead and drink with you tonight, or for me to use with you tonight, than for me to deny that. And so if we see a person who's been doing really good in their sobriety, and all of a sudden they've fallen off, or they've been doing really good in their treatment, and all of a sudden they're falling off, these are things we may want to question and go back and examine.
Yeah. Jim, someone just typed in that a sign for them was an abusive partner waiting in the lobby.
Very good. Well, actually, in our next slide, we kind of talk about that. So we'll talk about, oftentimes we talk about kind of an overprotective partner or an overconcerned defendant. So when we have, when we have the male partner, usually it's a male, who shows up with your offender demanding to come in with them during the interview. They will try to present themselves first as just being a very concerned partner who's there to be an emotional support for their significant other. And we have to really stand strong as a criminal justice system to say, no, that our interviews with our offenders are confidential and private. We're more than willing to meet with their significant others and collateral contacts in separate interviews, and to hear any of their concerns or any of the things that they want to share with us. But our interviews with any offender that we have, we're going to treat that as confidential as we would if we were meeting a victim. Now, we may see the same thing when we're going to home visits, right? All of a sudden, he's always following us around. Or we may have the significant other trying to answer the questions for our offender. So I ask, my offender, Megan, a certain question, and her partner keeps answering for her. So we may be a little bit aware of who's doing the answering. We may also look, do we have a partner, an offender who's constantly deferring to their partner? So maybe when I ask my offender a question, she's looking over for approval from her partner during my home visit before she answers. She may be hesitant to answer questions when her partner is in a room, and we might say, that's kind of odd. When I see her individually, this person's pretty forthcoming with information. We have good lines of communication, but when I see her in the home, she's much more hesitant and guarded. again, maybe a red flag. We have to be careful. If we see a red flag that's standing to us almost as a huge warning sign, but we think the perpetrator is in the room, not to ask any questions that's going to put that possible victim in a position where they either are forced to lie to me, or they're forced to feel that they have to answer the question that's going to cause them harm later on. So if I recognize that someone may be in danger, I recognize that there may be ongoing abuse, I need to figure out a time that I can talk to that person where it's 100% confidential. Interestingly enough, we know enough now to separate alleged perpetrators from alleged victims. We're suggesting we're going to separate our female offenders or male offenders from their significant others and give them that privacy when we interview them. It needs to be out of sight and out of ear sight sound, right? So we were doing a training, I think in Minnesota, and there was a probation officer who had a room with a big window. And perpetrators would actually sit outside the window and read the lips of their partners and would text them during the sessions. He literally says that now she goes in and shuts her screen every time she interviews an offender because she never knows what the people outside are doing to try to watch, monitor, read her reactions, question her. So just being aware of, how safe is it to talk in my office if somebody else is here? How safe is it to talk out in the community? What are the possible ramifications? What's tough is we want to engage our offenders' partners. Some of their partners can be really good collateral contacts. Some of them are going to offer great social support to help our offenders successfully complete treatment, successfully complete probation, get on the right track. But if that person is a perpetrator, we are not aiding them in any way, shape, or form by engaging with their partner, giving their partner confidential information, using their partner as a collateral contact. Because what a perpetrator will do is use the court, and you in particular as a probation officer, as a pawn to better control his victim, right? If I can tell her, you do this, I'm reporting it to probation. You don't do this, I'm gonna tell probation you did that. Maybe my partner's scared to death of me, wants to leave, and I say, you leave, you can't leave. You're on house arrest at this place, or probation knows you live here. You go here, I'm gonna tell them you're going to your druggy friends. I'm gonna tell them you're out doing drugs again, you're hanging with the wrong people. So these people feel that they have a lot of power and are using the court. What I have to do as a probation officer, when a partner of an offender calls and reports a violation of probation, there's always a question mark. What's their motivation? Are they seeking help for this person? Are they seeking punishment? Are they retaliating? And that's kind of a very, you got to walk that line very carefully, because I want their engagement, but I need to be aware of what their engagement really means. If we go to the next slide.
Well, so Jim, one
Yeah.
thing I want to make sure that we cover before moving ahead is, would you mind talking a little bit about some financial red flags?
Sure. So most of us hopefully do pre-sentence investigations. If we don't, I still think you can do this just through your average interviewing. All right. So what I want to know during a pre-sentence investigation is I want to know the economic standing of my offenders. So I want to know, do they have employment? How they do with managing money, how far they're in debt. So I'm meeting one time with a drunk driving offender. And so he comes in, strictly young man, probably 27 years old, has a great job, making $50,000 a year, just moved to Michigan from Southern California, moved to Southern California from Australia. Nice guy, low level, drunk driving, no problem, should be pretty standard interview, pretty standard conditions. When we get to economics, we find out this young man makes $50,000 a year. All right, then we look at, he doesn't have any savings account or any checking account. And I kind of thought that was kind of odd. If I made that kind of money, I would have access to my money. So we said, then he didn't have any credit cards. So he literally had zero access to finance. So then we looked at the car he was driving was leased in his roommate's name, but he called it his car, right? And how he found out that it was leased in his roommate's name is that we didn't have to put a boot on it, because it technically wasn't his. Then when we looked at his apartment living arrangements, he moved here with his roommate, but his name wasn't on the lease, yet he's contributed to paying for the rent. So all of a sudden, we're looking at this case of a young man who does not have a savings account, does not have a checking account, does not have a credit card, makes a significant amount of money, does not have anything to show for it, not a single thing in his name. And so we kind of went down several paths with this guy. I wasn't assuming that he was a victim of domestic violence. So I just kind of thought, well, maybe he has a drug problem and people who loved him cut off his access to resources so he didn't go out using drugs on a binge. We go down that road. He was a low-level alcoholic, but very high functioning. That should not have been the case. So then we went down, is this guy a gambler? Because Michigan has some gambling, here, and people have lost everything in their family, that cuts off their access to finances because they've gambled away their retirement, their homes, everything. He didn't have a gambling problem. Nothing seemed to match for this guy. And I'm not saying I did this tactfully. I'm not saying this is how you should do it. I ended up looking at him and I said, is your roommate hitting you? And he just started bawling. And he says, I didn't expect this to come out in here. And he had never told anyone he was being controlled and being abused by the person that he left Australia to engage in a relationship with. So now he's here in a country where he has no social supports. He's just been moved from LA to Michigan. He has zero access to resources and was totally controlled. Then when we went over his conditions, this is where it becomes problematic for us as probation officers. In my state, if you're busted for drunk driving, a standard condition is no use or possession of alcohol or illegal drugs, or being in the presence of anyone using or possessing any illegal drugs. So you cannot drink, even if you're not an alcoholic. And this gentleman was an alcoholic. But his roommate would mandate that he drink with him when they go out to dinner. Now, his roommate did not want him to be an alcoholic. His roommate wanted to mandate that he be a social drinker. But you and I know, if we've been working in this field long enough, that true alcoholics cannot maintain social drinking. If they could, they wouldn't be considered alcoholics, right? They'd just be social drinkers who sometimes party. But on Saturday nights, I had to ask him, if my order says you can't drink, what's going to happen when your roommate says you're going to drink? And he says, to be honest with you, he goes, I probably will drink because it caused me way too much problems. And so then we had to go back to the court and talk about, do I have some flexibility with this guy? Because if he goes and drinks on Saturday night with his roommate, and his roommate calls me and uses me as a pawn, is the court and the prosecutor prepared to lock this man in jail for something he really didn't have a choice in, and really he had to do to stay safe? Luckily for me, I have a great prosecutor, I had amazing judges, and I had a lot of flexibility. The other thing that we did with this gentleman, realize he's on a family phone account. Any text or phone numbers, his abuser would know that he had received. So I can't just hook him up with victim services. I can't just start texting him information. He doesn't have a car, so his abuser drives him to every appointment. He can't drive over to the shelter and talk to them. So what we ended up working is a partnership with our victim services. They came to my office, and I had him reporting more often than I probably would have for a first-time drunk driver. And half the time he reported, he didn't really report to me. Let's say it was Connie's organization and Connie came in. I would go out and meet him in the front lobby with his abuser sitting right next to him. I would thank them for coming and being on time. I'd grab his report. He would follow me back in the back room. But instead of talking to me in the probation, my office, we had an empty office that he would go meet with Connie. When he got done, he would come to my office. We would talk for a couple minutes, literally just a couple minutes, about if anything changed on his report, and I would walk him back out to the front office. I never asked Connie what they talked about. Connie never discloses what they talked about, but I knew that he was receiving some type of support from people who specialize in working with people victimized. I will tell you, at the end of his case, he did relapse for a while. We still had him going through treatment. But by the end of that year, he left that abusive partner and moved to New York. So I consider that a success. but I had to go in a slow process. I couldn't mandate he move away from his partner. I had zero control over his abusive partner. All I could do is recognize the red flags, acknowledge the injustice, and go work towards sending him to victim services. So if we're going to talk about working with victims, we want to know that there's some safety considerations, right? How are we reaching out to this group? How are we connecting them to victim services? We're pretty lucky. We have a domestic violence court. So I have victim advocates at arraignment. I have them there for sentencing. I have them there for our judicial reviews. So if a victim comes in asking for the no contact order to be lifted or anything like that, I can connect them in. Now, if I have an offender who I think is a victim, that's going to be a little bit different because that may not be in my domestic violence court, right? She's in my drunk driving court. Or in this guy, he was in a drunk driving court. But for her, she could be in a mental health court. She could be in a veterans court. So we have to figure out, how do I reach out to victim services for my non-traditional client? My client's just not coming through the door that we're used to. Again, that's kind of rearranging, talking with an organization like CONT and trying to figure out, what, where we should be sharing, what information I can give them, what their flexibility is. And we do a lot of warm handoffs as well, and we can talk about that in a little bit. We want to make sure that we're avoiding any victim blaming. And I'll say this comes kind of hard if we don't understand why this person's staying with that abuser. And think, you need to leave, you have to get out of here, this person's not good for you, you're not going to be able to stay sober, or use words like you're codependent, can actually be harmful. The research suggests that really 75% of our victims who are killed or attempted to be killed happened as they're leaving or attempted to be leaving. So for me to be pushing someone to get out of an abusive relationship before it's been well thought out and planned by that person could actually be causing them more harm. That's very uncomfortable for you as a probation officer. It was very uncomfortable with me with that drunk driver. He was a good guy. You felt he was experiencing huge unjust. I wanted to go out there, arrest his abuser, throw him on probation, mandate him into treatment, and I had no authority to do that. And for me to confront his abuser would actually put him at risk. So the only thing I could do was kind of support him, understand that he was in a really tough, difficult situation, that I believed he deserved better. And I believe that there was resources in the community that could help him with that. Sometimes the self-esteem has been destroyed. Oftentimes their access to resources have been destroyed. Their access to social supports have been destroyed. And so sometimes a person has to get those things slowly built up before they feel comfortable in taking steps to leave. And then they have to have some time where they're doing safety planning and organizing and stuff like that. So we want to be careful not to assume that a person is a victim because they hit that criteria. I'd also be aware of not using the word victim. Most people, in my experience, have not wanted to be called a victim. It feels very disempowering. It's a label that most people don't want. Now that might be different if you work for victim services because they're coming in the door and they've already acknowledged, I am a victim, I'm getting that. But probably the people that you're going to be working with have not acknowledged that yet. So for me to throw that label on them is going to feel more disempowering. Just to be careful of how we talk to people. I say somebody who's been victimized and kind of change my vocabulary like that. If we're engaging with victims, a lot of times when I'm asking questions, I'm doing it for two different purposes. One is to elicit information. I'm trying to get them to share with me so I can understand their life space and what I need to do differently and what I can do with the court. But I'm also trying to educate them. So sometimes the person you're interviewing may not be ready to trust you, and maybe for really good reasons. The court may have mistreated them before, the police may have mistreated them before. Any part of the system that's done them wrong, you're going to bear that punishment for. So we have to rebuild alliances with individuals. So I will use things like, many of the women have told me, oftentimes I have seen, research indicates, it has been my experience. So when I do these things, I'm not labeling that individual. I'm not saying this is who you are, but I am inviting them to the table to say, I've seen this, I understand this, I'm aware of this, I don't judge this. So it's more of inviting and less labeling and easier for a person to talk to. So we want to convey an understanding that we get what domestic violence is. And I could even say to a person, you know, I hear you, Sharon, that you don't feel that there's any abuse going on in your home, and I certainly hope that's true. It's been my experience that women who told me this is what they were experiencing, or research has shown this, right? So just kind of figure out how we can do that. If I hear a risk situation, let's say I think a person's being stalked, think about what resources do we have. I might be able to say, you know what, Sharon, I'm really concerned because what you're telling me, what Johnny's doing to show that he loves me, loves you, a lot of people would consider that stalking. In fact, under the law in my state, it would be considered stalking. And sometimes we're convinced that it's what love looks like, or this person really cares for me, but there's really some scarier messages in there. And I might even refer a person, if you go to coercivecontrol.org, they have a resource called the SHARP tool. It's just a series of questions. Any individual, I would encourage you to go to it yourself. Just go to that tool, type in the name of your offender. I've been told don't use your real partner's name because your partners don't like seeing their name on there if they're not really abusive, right? But just make up a person and just answer the questions. And then it will actually give you an assessment if you're being stalked, and it will help you with a safety plan. Then, if your client wants to do that tool, I would say to her, hey, Sharon, I'm concerned because what you're sharing with me sounds a little bit like you're being stalked. If that's the case, you could be in far more danger than you recognize. And I don't want to read about you or see you in the paper one day as being severely harmed or possibly even dead. There's a free tool you can use. You don't have to share it with me. It's just done by a bunch of experts that looks at certain behaviors and identifies the individuals being stalked. And if they are, it tells them some things they can do to possibly make them safer. If you do that tool, you can print it out. You can share it with me if you want to. If you don't want me to know, you don't have to share it with me at all. You could share it with Connie over here at Victim Services. She won't share it with anyone. She will sit on it if you ask her to. But then if you need it in the future, Connie can pull it out, or Connie could talk to you about how it could be used. You might be able to share it with the police or the prosecutor. And you can either go directly to the police and share it, or you may want to engage with me or Connie first. So just giving people, letting them know high-risk behavior is high risk. If violence has gotten worse, if somebody strangled you, you're 750 times more likely to be murdered by that individual than if they haven't strangled you. If you've had a partner who's ever threatened you with a gun. I have an offender in my batterers intervention program this week, and he came in saying he's never been violent. So he's a good guy, right? So then when we asked him why is he there, his text to his girlfriend when he was mad at her, she got pregnant, he didn't want her pregnant. He had texted her multiple times he was going to come over and beat the baby out of her. And then he went over and held an unloaded gun on her. He thought that was legal because it wasn't loaded. All right. So this is a guy who's making threats against a pregnant woman, multiple threats, driving over to a woman's house with a firearm, right? That's a huge risk. That woman never filed criminal charges on him at all. She didn't even file an order of protection on him. When she had the baby, he wanted to have visitation rights, and she didn't feel that he was a fit father that should have visitation rights, and she was scared, so she tried to deny them. And so they're in a child custody. And then in child custody, she shows the judges all the text. And the judge ordered him to the batterers intervention program, to these parenting things, all these other things. So be aware that the people we're working with aren't reporting their violence sometimes to the criminal justice system. They're not always engaging in the order of protection. But you could do a check on every client that you have to see if one's been done.
Okay, so what Jim has really been doing is really a great layout of the process to dig a little bit deeper. When he was talking about the process that he went through supervising that individual on drunk driving caseload, that is a process in which, so many community corrections officers, you may be the first person that is dealing with a survivor or victim of domestic violence in this way. To be able to think about red flags you get that gut feeling that just something doesn't quite add up, like something doesn't quite make sense. And the process that Jim laid out is, it's creating an open and warm environment for that individual to talk more about their abuse and their experiences of abuse. It's really setting the context for Jim as a community corrections professional listening, and then to be able to figure out ways that Jim could help support the safety of that individual on his caseload, whether it be reaching out to advocacy services, looking at what Jim could do within the orders and conditions of probation supervision. Are there any kind of workarounds, or are there any possible modifications? I think all that within the context of supporting the safety of that individual on the caseload. Again, there's so much domestic violence that goes without any criminal justice system involvement. Maybe 10% comes to the criminal justice system in the first place, and then a lot of times it's thinking through the process of pulling together the pieces of a puzzle. Something just doesn't feel right with this individual that you might be supervising. That's the flag in which it kind of opens the door to be able to ask more questions, and also to have that kind of relationship with domestic violence advocates in your community that really helps strengthen the supervision process. I think with community corrections professionals and domestic violence advocates, we share a lot of the same goals, that we are deeply concerned about safety, and we're deeply concerned that the system is working in the way that it's intended to work. And there's a lot of information that can really be brought to light with having individuals coming from two different perspectives that have those same shared goals and knowledge and understanding of domestic violence. For probation, parole, and community corrections professionals, I think of you all as experts in offender accountability. That is a primary focus of the work that you do day in and day out. And domestic violence advocates are experts in victim safety. A lot of times, domestic violence advocates work in shelters. They are answering hotline calls 24 hours a day. They're providing a whole range of support services for victims, and really know and understand the depth of some of those safety issues, and know and understand how that power and control can really play out for so many survivors in their community that they are working with. So there's a lot that advocates can do to really help you and help make your work easier. And some of that has to do with explaining the process of supervision for a victim who might be under supervision. A victim might be on your caseload. Kind of talking through, here's what to expect with the paperwork, or here's what to expect when you go meet with your probation officer at their office, or here's what to expect when the probation or community corrections officer is coming to your home to do a home visit, or here's really what those orders and conditions mean, and here's what the probation department might be asking of you. Again, those shared goals are that we want this person to successfully complete their supervision process, while at the same time maintaining that foundational perspective that safety is the most critical element of everything that we can do from our shared perspectives. And that work just becomes so much stronger when we have a strong collaboration in our community to do this. So the primary goals of advocates are to respect victim confidentiality, really look at ways that they can validate the experiences of victims, and sometimes acknowledge injustice. It's really looking at those ideas and those concepts that, frankly, sometimes life is just not fair for everyone. That what you've gone through, you don't deserve. When you're ready, help is available. And here's the kind of help that is available to you when that's something that you want to pursue or something that you want to hear more about. There's a lot of issues around autonomy and empowerment that's taken away from survivors by their abusers. And so that's such a critical point of what advocates can do, is to provide information about other kinds of services, whether it be support groups, whether it be advocacy with family court issues, if it's supervision, if it's custody, whatever it might be that survivor is asking for. Advocates are available in the community to make those kinds of connections and referrals and supports, and can oftentimes go along with that survivor when they are going through meetings and going through a process with working with multiple systems. And again, through relationships and collaborations, that can really open the door for a whole other range of services, so that you as community corrections professionals are much more informed with what's available to survivors of domestic violence. Whether or not you know that person, when they first walk in the door of your office, if you have an idea that person might be a survivor of domestic violence, or you don't, it unfolds during the supervision process. That goal of having shared collaboration and a strong relationship with advocates in your community is really looking at how can we all pull together and to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to help support the safety of that survivor and their children as they're moving forward through the supervision process.
Hey,
So
can I add something there? Yeah, I think when we have a good relationship with a good victim service organization and we know all the resources they have, we can help plug people in, because everyone has their stereotypes of what we think an addict is, what we think a victim is, what we think a domestic violence shelter is, or who they serve. So I have women who have not wanted to engage in the shelter either because they don't think they're a bad enough victim, right? They're not the burning bed woman. But yet when I went into their home and they had zero resources and no way to get their kids Christmas gifts, but I knew our domestic violence shelter had a place where parents could come in, pick all these toys for their kids. They even had a day that you could take in your kids and your kids could pick out toys for other children. Having those types of connections with the shelter and with women, I've been able to get people, once they went into the building and met that these were nice individuals, right, not there to tell them they had to leave or what they had to do, really made a difference. Same thing when I went into a home visit and seen a person sleeping on the floor, question if they had health conditions, and if that's why they were sitting, they said no, they just couldn't afford a bed, and we were able to work with and get them a bed there. Just really connecting victims to resources, especially if you can do that through victim services, is a great way to make that warm handoff.
And I think also, speaking of warm handouts, Jim, you as a probation officer might have like these nagging feelings that there's something there in your conversations with an individual on your caseload. You're not quite sure what to do, where to go, what kinds of questions that you might ask. And that is like a perfect situation where you can reach out and speak to an advocate. It's like, hey, what do you think about this situation? Here's what's going on. And that advocate can give you some thoughts and strategies and ideas. It's having that point of reference for you as a communications professional to really bounce off some ideas and get more information about, much more broadly, the nature and dynamics of domestic violence, but ways that you as a community corrections professional can balance what you need to do with supervising that person, but at the same time doing what you can to make sure that they're safe and they have access to all the resources that are available to them in the community.
So if we want to elaborate on that, if I had a client in my room who I had concerns for, but maybe she wasn't sharing stuff with me, but in my heart, I kind of thought there's something going on with this, I might be able to say to that person, hey, Megan, I know we talked about this. I felt some hesitancy there. I'm really concerned that maybe there's some issues that you might feel more comfortable talking with somebody who is 100% confidential, maybe a woman. And so I've been able to call victim services on the phone, put them on speakerphone, and without giving my client's name initially, and just kind of say, hey, Connie, this is Jim. I got you on speakerphone. Is that okay? I talked to Connie about a few things, get some ideas from Connie, and I've been able to actually link victims up that way too. Because once they heard Connie's voice, seen Connie didn't sound scary, realized that there wasn't going to be charges or that I wasn't going to get any private information on them, or the court wasn't going to get it, or the police wasn't going to get it, that made a big difference from somebody who's, if a perpetrator hasn't been held accountable and the victim does not have confidence that the system can keep her safe, it is in their best interest oftentimes not to tell us, right? Because they're too scared of how this can come back and hurt them. So having those linkages are so important. I appreciate the work you guys do with us.
So I think there are other things that community corrections professionals that you all can do to help create this environment of resources that are available in your community. Something simply like having posters in your office, having brochures, things like palm cards, information about hotline numbers. There are a lot of probation departments, community corrections departments that might have that not only out in the waiting room, but maybe in the bathroom stalls, or in your office, in the interview rooms. And whether or not that survivor takes you up on that offer to make that call or reach out to the advocacy program at that moment in time, it's really trying to have that perspective that it might not be the best thing for them to do in that moment because they are safety planning for what they know or think their abuser is going to do next, but knowing that you are a resource. It's building that kind of warm relationship and that perspective that while they're on your caseload, while they are under supervision, that you have additional resources for them when they are ready to take you up on that. Just again, you may never know if they reach out to that advocacy organization, if they're not willing to go through a warm handoff process at that point in time that Jim just described, they may do that next week or next month. But it's setting the tone, it's setting the perspective that not only are there resources and help available for them, but it's also for them to know and hear from you as a community corrections professional that they didn't deserve the abuse that they went through. When they're ready, help is available. And there are people willing to do what they can to help support their safety. And just a few words like that means so much to survivors to know that they can count on you for those base levels of support.
Okay, so I know we've covered a lot of information today, but also that everything we've talked about is sort of barely scratching the surface. We've given y'all some examples and some things to think about, but we also want to leave y'all with some additional resources to be able to look deeper into the current topic. So here we have the National Domestic Violence Hotline. In addition to the 24/7 national hotline, every state has a domestic violence coalition that'll be able to help survivors connect to more localized services and resources. Connie, do you want to talk for a moment about some of the coalitions?
Sure. As Megan mentioned, in every state and U.S. territories, there is a statewide coalition. And if you're not really sure in your community where the local domestic violence advocacy program is or how to make that connection, state coalitions are there as a resource for you. There's a link on the slide here that you will see through the National Network to End Domestic Violence. That's how to reach out to your statewide domestic violence coalition. Again, that coalition can make connections to you around advocacy services in various parts of your state. And sometimes there are survivors that are moving from one state to the next. If you're looking at any kind of transfer issues, that's also a national resource that you can connect with coalitions in various states based on what the needs are of individuals that you're working with. And then just one other thing about the National Domestic Violence Hotline number. There are some handoffs that the National Domestic Violence Hotline can do automatically, some transfers of calls. If there's really one number to give out to survivors, that's a great one because there's such a range of information and support for individuals nationally that, again, it's another point of reference and another point of providing resources to those individuals that you're supervising.
Additionally, APPA and its partners have put together a comprehensive guide for working with victims of intimate partner violence. We've referenced aspects of the guidelines indirectly throughout the presentation. The entire document is available for free online at APPA's website on the link at the bottom of the page. We definitely encourage those of you with additional questions, both regarding working with victims and supervising offenders, to check out the guidelines. There are additional resources located inside them as well. Also, as part of the current project, there are 3 free online trainings. Each are only about an hour. These courses are part of a larger online blended training curriculum, which also includes an 8-hour, 1-day in-person training. Anyone interested in that 8-hour training should contact me directly. But these 3 online courses, as well as several others, are available for free online on APPA's website. So just kind of some final touches. We know that community corrections professionals have a pretty complex job. We normally start working with offenders with the idea that we're just going to hold them accountable, but we really need to shift our line of thinking. We know that most of the people that are coming into our offices or coming into our agencies have longstanding backgrounds with trauma and might be experiencing trauma in the current in the status quo that might be affecting their ability to adhere to the terms of supervision. And so really thinking about our clients in a more three-dimensional way can go a long way to improving community safety and improving their individual outcomes. Now, we did want to leave some time for questions. We know that while we provided some examples for you guys, a lot of you might have some specific situations that you have questions about or concerns about, and we want to leave the opportunity for people to ask questions about some of those circumstances. All right. So I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
The only thing, if I could add something, is
Sure, Dan.
if we find, one of the things that APPA suggests is if we find out that one of our offenders is a victim of domestic violence, that each of us should go back through and look through their conditions of probation or parole and kind of go through every condition with that individual and ask if that condition puts them at risk or puts them in danger, and then ask how. And then we need to do safety planning around that area, and we may even need to go back to the court to look at modifying an order. So let's say I have somebody on house arrest with their perpetrator. But he's not the, he's a batterer, but they're there for their own drug use or their own thing. Maybe house arrest isn't the best deal for them. And if the courts are going to keep him on house arrest and not move it off, can I talk about my client when they feel at risk and need to leave, what they can do to not violate that? Can they notify me? Where would they go? Would I be able to do a visit? Would that meet the objectives of the court? Would that meet the objectives of the prosecutor or the judge? But just being able to go back through those conditions and really think those through and think, okay, is this best? Is this not? Asking how I could respond differently when I come to the home, or what types of things I should be aware of not to put them at risk. And just let people know that we're sensitive to the areas, we're willing to look at it. And if I don't have an answer, those are things I need to set up meetings with, where I call victim services, I call maybe the substance abuse agencies, whoever's working with that individual client, and kind of do this wraparound meeting where we talk about how do we keep Sharon safe in this scenario, and how do we still help her achieve the conditions of her parole or her probation. So we really encourage you to do that.
Absolutely. Lastly, all of us are available for additional questions. We encourage all of you to reach out if you have any additional interest in the project, questions, concerns, or interest in any future projects that we might be working on. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we're actually going to wrap up a few minutes early. Hope you all have a good rest of your Monday.
Thank you. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks for joining us.